What kind of man does a child run to when she knows the police won't come in time? The glass doors of a downtown Chicago steakhouse opened just enough to let the cold night air slip in, but what followed wasn't the wind. It was a small figure, barefoot, breathless, and trembling as if the city itself had chased her inside. Amara Johnson was 8 years old. Her hoodie too thin for the early spring chill, her hands stained not with anything violent but with the kind of desperate urgency that comes from trying to hold on to something slipping away. Conversations stopped one by one as heads turned, the clink of silverware fading into a low murmur of discomfort. People in tailored suits and designer heels shifted in their seats, not out of concern, but irritation. This was a place where steaks cost over $100 and valet tips started at $20. Not a place where a child like her belonged. A manager moved quickly, his polished shoes silent against the marble floor, already rehearsing the words he would use to remove the disruption. But Amara didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone else. Her eyes searched the room with a focus that didn't match her age until they landed on a man sitting alone at the far end. Ethan Kong didn't need an introduction. Not in this city. His presence carried the kind of quiet authority that made conversations lower without him saying a word. His suit was perfectly cut. His watch caught the light just enough to hint at its price, and the men standing near the walls, pretending to be part of the decor, were anything but ordinary. He was the kind of man people avoided looking at directly, not out of respect, but instinct, and yet, Amara walked straight toward him, her small steps echoing louder than they should have. The manager reached for her arm, whispering something about calling the police, about rules, about places like this not being for people like her. But she pulled away, not violently, just enough, as if she had already decided none of that mattered. She stopped a few feet from Ethan's table, her chest rising and falling, her voice shaking but clear enough to cut through the silence that had settled over the room. "They're beating my mama, please." The words didn't sound rehearsed, they didn't sound like a performance, they sounded like a decision. The kind a child makes when every other option has already failed. Forks hovered midair, glasses paused halfway to lips, and somewhere in the room, someone let out a quiet scoff, as if this was all just an inconvenience to be corrected. Ethan didn't move, not at first. His gaze rested on the girl in front of him, steady, unreadable, as if he were studying something that didn't quite fit into the world he controlled. He had seen fear before, he had seen desperation, but this was different. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no confusion about who she had chosen to approach, and that was what made it unsettling, because in a room full of people who might have offered help, she had walked past all of them, past the ones who looked safe, past the ones who would call authorities, and stopped in front of the one man who didn't need permission to act. The manager's voice tightened as he tried again, insisting this wasn't the way, that procedures existed for a reason, but Amara didn't turn, didn't blink, didn't break eye contact, as if the entire room had faded away and there was only one person left who could decide what happened next. And for the first time that evening, something almost imperceptible shifted in Ethan Kang's expression. Not concern, not yet, but recognition. The kind that comes when a situation stops being simple and starts becoming personal, the kind that makes a powerful man pause. Not because he has to, but because somewhere, deep beneath everything he has built, something unfamiliar begins to stir. The car slowed to a near-silent crawl as it turned into a narrow street where the glow of the city seemed to fade into something colder, something less certain. The buildings pressed closer together, their windows dark or flickering with tired fluorescent light, and even the air felt different, heavier, like a place that had learned to exist without being noticed. "We are here," the driver said quietly, his voice lower than before, as if the location itself demanded a different tone. Ethan did not respond. Immediately, his eyes scanning the street through the tinted glass, measuring distances, exits, shadows, habits built over years that never truly switched off. But beneath that calculation, something else remained, that single sentence echoing in his mind. "They said you would come back for what is yours." It did not fit, not cleanly, not in any way he could categorize, and that was what made it dangerous. The vehicle came to a stop, the engine still running. A low hum beneath the silence. One of his men stepped out first, moving with controlled precision, checking the immediate surroundings, not searching for obvious threats, but for irregularities, for anything that suggested this was more than it appeared. Amara opened her door before anyone could stop her, stepping out onto the cracked pavement without hesitation, as if she had already memorized this place long before tonight. Ethan followed a second later, his shoes touching ground that seemed worlds away from the polished marble floor he had left behind less than 20 minutes ago. The contrast was not lost on him, but he did not comment. He simply adjusted his jacket and looked ahead. "Which way?" he asked, his voice steady, but now carrying a sharper edge. Amara pointed toward a narrow alley between two buildings, barely visible from the street. A space most people would ignore without a second glance, but she did not hesitate. She moved toward it immediately, and Ethan watched her for a brief moment before following, his men exchanging a glance behind him, the kind that passed information without words. This was no longer routine. The alley was dim, the only light coming from a distant street lamp that cast long shadows across uneven ground. The kind of place where sound carried differently, where even footsteps seemed louder than they should be, and yet what stood out most was not what they heard, but what they did not. There were no raised voices, no obvious signs of chaos, only a strange stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, as if whatever had happened here had already reached a point beyond noise. Ethan slowed his pace slightly, his instincts sharpening. This did not match the urgency he had been brought here for. It did not match the image of a situation spiraling out of control. Instead, it felt contained, almost as if it had been waiting. Amara stopped near the end of the alley, her small figure framed by the faint light behind her, and for the first time since they had arrived, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Like someone arriving at a moment they had been preparing for, Ethan stepped beside her, his gaze shifting past her toward the darker space ahead. And that was when he saw her. Danielle Johnson stood near the far wall, not collapsed, not helpless, but upright. Her posture tense yet controlled, her eyes locked onto Ethan the moment he appeared. There was no relief in her expression, no visible gratitude, only a quiet intensity that did not belong to someone expecting to be saved. Ethan's steps slowed to a stop, the distance between them measured not in meters, but in something far more complex, something that had been building long before. "This night, you took your time," Danielle said, her voice steady, carrying clearly through the still air, and for the first time since he had left the restaurant, Ethan Kong felt something shift that he could not immediately explain. Not fear, not hesitation, but recognition without memory. The kind that unsettles because it suggests a connection you do not yet understand. His mind moved quickly, searching, analyzing, but nothing aligned cleanly. Nothing fit into the categories he relied on. And yet, standing there in that narrow space, with a child who had chosen him and a woman who did not look like she needed saving, Ethan realized that whatever this was, it had never been about a simple request for help, and more importantly, it had never been about control. For a moment, no one moved. Not Ethan. Not the men behind him. Not even the city beyond the alley that seemed to hold its breath. The distance between Ethan Kong and Danielle Johnson stretched across barely a few meters, yet it felt like something far older, something unresolved. "You said they were hurting you?" Ethan said finally, his voice calm but edged with a quiet authority that had settled countless situations before. They could escalate, but this time, the words did not land the way he expected. Danielle did not respond with relief or urgency. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him as if measuring something invisible. "Is that what she told you?" she asked, her gaze flicking briefly toward Amara before returning to him. The question lingered in the air, not defensive, not accusatory, but deliberate, as if every word spoken here had already been considered long before this moment. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recalibration. This was no longer aligning with the pattern he had assumed. "You are not in danger?" he asked, more directly now, the simplicity of the question cutting through the ambiguity. Danielle let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite exhaustion, something in between. "Oh, I am," she said, her voice steady. "Just not in the way you think." And with that, she shifted her stance slightly, enough for something small and metallic to catch. The faint light near her hand. Ethan's attention moved instantly, not to react, but to recognize. His mind working through details at a speed that had made him untouchable in rooms filled with far more obvious threats. It was not a weapon, not anything meant to harm, but it was important, that much was clear. One of his men stepped forward instinctively, but Ethan lifted a hand, stopping him without looking back. His focus locked entirely on Danielle. "What is that?" he asked, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was a subtle shift in his tone, not uncertainty, but something closer to caution. Danielle looked down at the object for a brief moment before meeting his eyes again. "Something you lost?" she said, and the words settled heavily, not because of what they meant, but because of how certain she sounded. Ethan's expression remained composed, but inside, something moved, a quiet disruption in the structure he relied on. "I do not lose things," he replied, the statement simple, factual, the kind of truth he had built his reputation on. Danielle's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in recognition. "That is what you told yourself," she said softly, and then, after a brief pause, 5 years ago. The alley seemed to grow smaller around them, the sound of distant traffic fading into something distant and irrelevant. Ethan did not react outwardly, but the number settled somewhere deeper, somewhere that did not respond immediately. His mind moved through years of operations, decisions, contracts, people who had come and gone without leaving a trace, and for a moment nothing connected, nothing surfaced clearly until it did, not as a full memory, but as a fragment, a file, a report, a name that had been marked, processed, and closed, something that had never needed to be revisited. "You are mistaken," Ethan said, his voice returning to its usual calm, but now carrying a weight that had not been there before. Danielle shook her head slowly, her grip tightening slightly around the small object. "No," she said, her voice no longer distant, no longer controlled in the same way, but not breaking either. "I was erased," she continued, each word deliberate, "and you signed it." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with something neither of them spoke aloud. Behind Ethan, his men remained still, waiting for direction that had not yet come, and beside him, Amara stood quietly, her eyes moving between them, not confused, not afraid, but watching, as if this moment was not new to her, as if she had already known what would unfold long before Ethan ever stepped into that alley. And in that realization, something shifted again, deeper this time, not just in understanding but in perspective, because for the first time since he had arrived, Ethan Kong was no longer certain that he had been brought here to fix a problem, but instead to face one that had been waiting for him all along. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, not because they were loud, but because they carried a weight that did not belong to the present moment. Ethan Kong had heard accusations before, threats, desperation disguised as blame, but this was different. There was no emotion pushing Danielle's voice forward, no attempt to provoke, only certainty, and certainty was far more dangerous than anger. "You signed it?" she had said, and for a brief second something inside Ethan shifted, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it, like a hairline crack in something that had always felt solid. His mind moved quickly, faster than most could follow, pulling fragments from years of decisions, names reduced to files, lives reduced to numbers, operations completed with efficiency that left no room for memory. And yet, there it was again, that faint recognition, incomplete but persistent, like a word on the tip of his tongue that refused to fully form. "If you are here," Ethan said slowly, choosing each word with care, "then whatever you think happened did not finish the way it was intended." The statement was not defensive, not an apology, but a recalibration, an attempt to reassert logic over something that felt increasingly unpredictable. Danielle watched him without interrupting, her eyes steady, as if she had already heard every version of this response before. It was spoken. "That is exactly the problem," she replied, her voice quiet but unyielding. "You think this is about something unfinished?" She lifted the small object slightly, enough for the dim light to reflect across its surface again. A simple device, unremarkable to anyone else, but to Ethan, it now carried a gravity he could not ignore. "This was finished," she continued, "perfectly, efficiently, exactly how your system was designed to work." The words were not spoken with bitterness, but with clarity, as if she were explaining a mechanism rather than reliving a moment, and that clarity unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Behind him, one of his men shifted his stance slightly, waiting for direction, for the moment when this would return to something actionable, something familiar, but Ethan did not give it. Not yet. His focus remained entirely on Danielle. "Then why bring me here?" he asked, and for the first time, there was a trace of something new in his voice, not weakness, not doubt, but a question that did not come with an immediate answer. Danielle's gaze softened, just slightly, not with sympathy, but with recognition, as if she had been waiting for that exact question. "I did not bring you here," she said, her eyes moving briefly toward Amara. "She did." The alley seemed to shift again, not physically, but in the way it was understood. Ethan's attention flicked to the girl beside him, and in that moment, something else became clear, something he had overlooked from the beginning. Amara had not reacted the way a child should have. She had not cried once since entering this space, had not asked what would happen next, had not shown the confusion that usually followed fear. Instead, she had moved with purpose, with direction, and now, standing between them, she looked not like someone waiting to be saved, but like someone waiting for something to be confirmed. "Why me?" Ethan asked, the question no longer directed at Danielle, but at the girl who had chosen him. Amara met his gaze without hesitation, her voice quiet, but steady in a way that did not match her age. "Because you are the only one who can understand what she is holding," she said, and the words settled deeper than anything spoken before. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in realization. This had never been about help, never been about intervention. This was about recognition, about forcing him to see something he had been able to ignore for years, and as that understanding began to take shape, the structure he had relied on, the certainty that had defined every decision he made, began to shift, not collapsing, not yet, but no longer untouched, because for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Kong was not looking at a problem to solve, but at a truth he could not immediately control. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, not empty, but filled with the quiet weight of something irreversible beginning to take shape. Ethan Kong stood still, his gaze resting on Amara, not with authority anymore, but with a kind of attention he rarely gave anything he could not immediately control. "Understand what?" he asked, his voice lower now, not softer, but more deliberate, as if each word had to pass through something newly uncertain before it could be spoken. Amara did not look away, her small frame steady in a way that felt almost unnatural against the narrow alley and the dim, flickering light. "What she kept," she said, and her eyes moved briefly toward Danielle's hand, where the small device rested like something far heavier than its size suggested. Ethan followed that glance again, but this time, he did not see it as just an object. He saw it as a connection, a point where past decisions and present consequences intersected, and for the first time, the fragments in his mind began to align, not completely, but enough to form a shape he could no longer ignore. 5 years ago, a series of internal audits had exposed irregularities, numbers that did not match, accounts that did not close cleanly. It had been handled quickly, efficiently, as everything under his name always was. A name had been attached to the discrepancy, a junior accountant, nothing significant, nothing that required personal attention. The file had been processed, signed, and removed from the system, not erased, just concluded. And yet, standing here now, Ethan realized that conclusion had not been absolute. Danielle watched the shift in his expression, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to confirm what she had already known before he even arrived. "You remember," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Ethan did not respond immediately, because what he was remembering was not a person, not a story, but a process, a system that reduced everything to outcomes, and that realization unsettled him more than anything else could have. "You were never supposed to survive that," he said finally, the words leaving his mouth before he fully considered them, and the moment they did, something in the air changed, not sharply, not violently, but undeniably. Danielle did not flinch, did not react with anger or fear. Instead, she nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something she had already accepted long ago. "Exactly," she said, her voice calm. "And yet here I am." Amara shifted slightly beside Ethan, not stepping closer, not retreating, just enough movement to remind him that she was still there, still watching, still waiting, and in that moment, Ethan understood something else, something he had missed from the beginning. This was not just about Danielle proving a point. This was about Amara witnessing it, about making sure the truth was not just revealed, but seen. "You brought him here to show him?" Ethan said, his voice quieter now, directed toward Danielle, but his eyes flicking briefly toward Amara. Danielle's gaze softened again, just slightly, not with forgiveness, but with something more complex, something closer to necessity. "No," she said. "I brought him here so he could not pretend anymore." The distinction settled heavily because it removed the last layer of distance Ethan had tried to maintain. This was not about information, not about clarification, this was about accountability, and accountability was not something he had ever been forced to confront in this way. One of his men shifted again behind him, uncertainty creeping into a space that was usually defined by precision and control. But Ethan did not turn, did not acknowledge it. His attention remained fixed on the two figures in front of him, one who had survived something he had signed away without a second thought, and one who had crossed the city not to beg for help, but to bring him here, to this exact moment. And as the realization settled deeper, Ethan Kong felt something unfamiliar, not fear, not weakness, but a loss of certainty, the kind that does not break a man immediately, but begins to reshape him from within, because for the first time in a very long time, he was no longer the one deciding what mattered, he was the one being forced to see it. The air in the alley no longer felt like something temporary, it felt fixed, as if the moment itself had anchored everything in place. Ethan Kong stood without moving, yet inside, the structure that had defined him for years continued to shift, not collapsing, not breaking, but rearranging in ways he could not immediately control. "If you wanted me to see this," he said slowly, his voice measured but no longer untouched, "you could have come directly." The statement carried logic, the kind that had resolved countless situations before they could become complicated. But even as he spoke, something in him already knew the answer. Would not follow the same pattern. Danielle's expression did not change, but her eyes held something deeper now, something that had moved beyond explanation and into something closer to truth. "No," she said quietly. "If I came to you, you would have turned it into a negotiation." Her gaze flicked briefly toward the device in her hand, then back to him. "And this was never about that." The words landed with precision, not harsh, not emotional, but undeniable. Ethan did not respond immediately, because what she said was correct, not as an accusation but as a fact. He had built his world on negotiation, on control, on the ability to shape outcomes before they could shape him. And yet, standing here now, he realized that had already happened, not tonight but years ago, and he had never noticed. "Then what is it about?" he asked, and this time the question carried something different, not authority, not challenge, but a need to understand something that no longer fit within his system. Danielle took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but as if marking the transition between what had been hidden and what could no longer remain that way. "It is about what happens after you decide someone does not matter," she said, her voice steady, each word deliberate. "It is about what is left behind when a file is closed and a life continues anyway." The alley seemed to grow quieter, not because the world outside had changed, but because everything inside this moment demanded attention. Ethan's eyes lowered briefly to the ground, not in submission, but in thought, his mind moving through the process again, the reports, the signatures, the decisions that had been made without hesitation, without personal involvement, because they had never required it, and yet, here was the result, standing in front of him, undeniable, uncontained. "You survived," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that still felt incomplete. Danielle nodded once. "Barely," she replied, and for the first time, there was a hint of something else in her voice, not weakness, but the weight of time, of everything that had followed. "But surviving was never the point," she continued, her eyes shifting briefly toward Amara again, and in that glance, something else became clear. Something Ethan had not fully considered until now. This was not just about the past. It was about the future that had grown from it. Amara stood quietly, her presence no longer just that of a child caught in something too large, but as someone who had lived with the consequences of a decision she had never been part of. "She grew up inside what you left behind," Danielle said softly, and the words settled deeper than anything before them because they did not accuse, they revealed. Ethan looked at Amara again. Really looked this time, not as a situation, not as a variable, but as a person shaped by something he had set in motion without ever knowing it. And in that moment, the final layer of distance began to fall away, because this was no longer about a mistake, no longer about an oversight, this was about impact, about a chain of events that had extended far beyond the point where he had stopped paying attention, and as that realization settled, heavier than anything else that night, Ethan Kong understood something he had never been forced to confront before. That power did not end when a decision was made. It continued, quietly, invisibly, shaping lives in ways he had never needed to see, until now. The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like something heavy finding its place after being ignored for far too long. Ethan Kong remained still, but the way he looked at Amara had changed, no longer measuring, no longer calculating, but searching, as if trying to understand a story that had been unfolding without him. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly, the question directed at her this time, not at Danielle, and it carried something unfamiliar, not authority, but restraint. Amara did not answer immediately, her eyes drifting for a moment toward the ground before lifting again to meet his. "I did not know your name at first," she said, her voice calm, steady. "Just that there was someone who made decisions and then disappeared." The words were simple, but they carried a clarity that cut deeper than accusation. Ethan felt that again, that subtle shift inside him, the kind that did not break but refused to stay the same. "My mom did not talk about it," Amara continued, her tone unchanged. "Not the way people talk about things they want to forget." She paused briefly, as if choosing what mattered most. She talked about it like something she was waiting to finish. Danielle closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in regret, but in acknowledgement, as if hearing her own intentions spoken aloud carried a weight she had carried alone for years. Ethan's gaze moved between them, connecting pieces that had never existed in the same place before. "So this was planned?" he said, more to himself than to either of them, but the words hung in the air regardless. Danielle opened her eyes again, her expression steady. "No," she replied. "This was inevitable." And that distinction landed harder than anything else, because it removed the idea of control entirely. This had not been set in motion by strategy, but by consequence. "You were always going to face this?" she continued, her voice quiet but firm. "Whether it was today or 10 years from now." Ethan let out a slow breath, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the moment, because for the first time, he was not looking for a way to redirect what was happening. He was beginning to accept it, not fully, not without resistance, but enough to stop searching for an exit that did not exist, and the device, he said, his eyes returning to the small object in her hand. "What exactly does it contain?" Danielle looked down at it again, her fingers tightening slightly, not out of fear, but out of awareness. "Everything that proves your system works exactly the way you intended," she said, and then, after a brief pause, "and everything that shows what it costs." The words did not rise, did not demand attention, they settled, heavy and unavoidable. Ethan's mind moved quickly again, but this time not to dismiss or control, but to understand the scope of what she was saying. This was not just about her, not just about one file, one decision. This was something larger, something that reached into the structure he had built and revealed parts of it he had never needed to examine. "You are going to use it?" he said, not as a question, but as a recognition of what came next. Danielle nodded once. "Tomorrow morning," she replied, her voice steady. "I meet with people who will not ignore it." And there it was, the next step, the consequence that extended beyond this alley, beyond this night, into something that could not be contained once it began. Ethan did not react outwardly, but inside, the weight shifted again, not toward panic, not toward urgency, but toward something far more difficult: responsibility, because for the first time, the outcome of a situation was not something he could shape before it happened. It was something he had already set in motion, and now, he was standing at the point where it would either continue without him or change because of him, and in that space, with the city quiet around them and two lives shaped by his past decisions standing directly in front of him, Ethan Kong realized that whatever choice came next would not just define what happened to them, it would define what kind of man he had been all along.